Tim Dawson was a student of mine some years back, and I've really devoted this particular part of this lecture, part A, to his work. He graduated, I think, 2 years ago, in fourth year, with quite a phenomenal body of work, of the sorts that you rarely see actually in a fourth year context, especially with sculpture. Anyway, the work you're seeing now is actually his first year work. It was a first year portfolio that he submitted, and along with all the little maquettes and the final works and his workbooks, he produced a series of animations. And I think the reason why I wanted to emphasize what he's doing here is because not only is he taking the sculptural form into a digital mode, which is totally okay for THF1501, but he's also demonstrating a very unique engagement with the processes and materials that he is starting to become familiar with. And you'll notice he's working with wire, he's working with cork, he's working with mesh, plastic, different kinds of wire, as well as bread. There's some really beautiful animations here where he works with bread. So I guess in so many ways I wanted you to understand the diversity of materials that this man can work with, but also most importantly how he takes it into an animation, a stop frame animation process, which isn't that difficult to produce. It just is quite laborious and takes a long time. But these are just short little sketches that he produced. I mean, there's nothing particularly fancy about these videos. It just gives us an idea that his mind is looking way beyond just a sculpture in a static space. It's considering sculpture in a digital space, and that's interesting. In the second part of Lecture 4 series, I'm focusing on two things. On the maquettes, as well as some indication of final works. Mostly these works have got to do with assignment 2, which is the body, which I think is really important for you to see. So in this first slide, this is a Cape Town student, and I think what is so amazing about the maquettes the student presented, which is on the right-hand side, image on the right, was the diversity of materials it was experimented with. It was quite phenomenal, actually. It went from packaging tape to polystyrene to tape to string to wire to bits of plastic. What's really important about these maquettes, especially this particular student, was how they had struggled and grappled with the idea of connecting materials together. And it's probably a good idea for you to spend some time in your workbook investigating assemblage and construction technologies. And what I mean by that is simply things like tying, welding, bolting, cable tying, sewing, wiring, stapling, what are some of the other things? Knitting, gluing, different gluing technologies. Within that, you've got a whole range of glues that you could be investigating: wood glue to contact glue to epoxy glues. And also adhesive surfaces like tape or adhesive foam. And I think the students' work really demonstrates quite a vast engagement, at the second level assessment with different materials. Yeah. This is an interesting student who decided to look very resourcefully and purposefully at his immediate environment to create these strange animated-like, comic-like figures out of waste material. And what's interesting here is how he's transforming found objects into something quite convincingly bizarre and interesting. And one of the suggestions we had for him was that he start thinking about animation. And you can see how these potentially could be quite very interesting animated characters. So you've seen this student's work already. I've showed you the table on the left-hand side with the maquettes and the experiments. The work on the right is a product of a lot of those experiments and was produced out of paper mache. Um, and what's remarkable there is not just the quite accurate proportions of the figure, but also the way the paper mache starts to homogenize the surface. In other words, flatten the surface out. And that was quite an interesting decision that the student made in representing the figure in this way, that she decided not to paint it, not to give it any much more detail, but to allow the materiality of the paper mache to become the surface itself, to become that rough surface, and made a very clear decision to allow that to happen. I want to say that a lot of materials bring with them their own unique character, and sometimes it becomes a big mistake if you try and change that or conceal it by painting it or varnishing it or finishing it in any other way. Paper mache is a particularly unique material because it can be it can be worked up in the final stages to become something totally different to what it is. It was interesting that the student allowed the paper pulp to become part of the finished product of that sculpture. This was another assignment 2 work. It was a self-portrait that the student did. She produced a cast of her face using silicone. She got somebody to help her. And then she superimposed that onto this sort of rock-like, tree-like structure that she had created. It's a life-size figure. Um, and I guess it, in many ways, is interesting because she did make the decision to add makeup and paint onto the figure, and I'm not entirely sure still whether that was the right decision. I think that if you are going to paint up a surface like plaster, which is what she was working with here, you really do need to be quite careful because you're trying to create a visual equivalence, and that visual equivalence can start to look like a really bad standard 1 geography project. And that was one of the criticisms that I had for her in this work, was that if she is working with paint, she needs to really work that surface to become extremely convincing, and that is the important thing here. If you can make your finished product convincing in the way you're handling the material and the processes, then you're onto something. This in the next slide, the student is interpreting the body in relation, or metaphorically in relation, to a finger digit. There are 2 separate sculptures that were produced. One is the singular thumb-like sculpture, and the next one on the next page, next slide, is where she produces 2 figures in a kind of dance-like format. What's interesting is the contrast in texture, where you've got this rough plaster, and then on the other hand, this very smooth, polished plaster. So finish becomes a significant consideration here. Yeah, I stand corrected. She's in fact only worked with plaster here. The shiny thumbs that she's presented, that she presents in this work, there are only 2 of them, by the way, are just very interestingly finished with a kind of polish. So she's creating a contrast in texture between something that's rough, such as the spiky um, finger, and the very smooth, polished plaster surface of the other finger. So the 2, and interestingly enough, she presents it in space that they start to interact almost as a kind of dance. So there's a physical interaction that's implied in the 2 works, which works really well. You've seen the student's work as well. I wanted to bring it up again simply because I think that, and really re-emphasize this idea of how sculptural drawing becomes such an important part of the realization of the final work. When you're moving from your experimental maquettes into a drawing process where you're planning and working out how you're going to make it and what technologies you're going to use into the actual making process. And in the next slide, you can in fact see the little pod that was produced from this exercise. What's remarkable about the students' work is really the diversity of materials that are used as well, and experimenting with completely unconventional and untraditional processes and sculptural materials to create these really unique, interesting, quite dynamic shapes and forms. They start to take on the aspect of a sort of otherworldly vessel of some sort. this last little work is a very beautiful piece. In fact, it's one of, I think, about 4 or 5 little animals that were created. I've chosen to show you the bunny because there's something so incredibly bodily, human bodily, about the way she's chosen to make this sculpture, and also that she's made a deliberate a deliberate decision to have it on its side, as if sleeping like a human would. So even though she's got an anamorphic or animalistic aspect to it in terms of the bunny head, there's something quite human-like in its form. In addition to that, it's interesting that she's chosen to work with with these kinds of materials. So she's working with embroidery, sewing, knitting, um, and obviously some sort of stuffing involved there as well to create this piece, which conceptually feeds back into the work as being as referring to or recalling a child's toy, um, and more specifically something that a child might hold very dear. So it's so interesting how the fabric and material that's used here deliberately sets up very specific meanings in the work. And these are things that you can start to consider as well. And I spoke about it earlier in a lecture where where I referred to this idea of how using fabric or material or any kind of sculptural material needs to be done in a way that you transform it, especially when you're working with found objects and found materials. One's got to really transform it to become something completely convincingly something else, and done in a completely convincing way. So just bear that in mind, and you can see it operating really nicely in this piece.